So 2 weeks ago, I did a reading from particularly John's Gospel where Jesus is addressing the Father. And last week, I took readings from the Acts of the Apostles and from Genesis, talking about Babel and Pentecost and Spirit. And so today, I decided to use a reading. It's a poem I wrote on November 26, 2013. And in some senses, it pulls these elements together. I call it, Can You Hear the Wind Blowing? Listen. Can you hear the wind blowing? I mean, can you hear the wind blowing? Mostly, we don't hear it at all. Or if we do, it's merely a background annoyance. If you really listen, at first, you may be forgiven for thinking that the noises it makes are simply its frustrations with the obstacles it encounters. But that is not the case at all. What you hear, when you really listen, is the wind co-opting everything it meets into the orchestra of life. It is the ultimate persuader, turning ordinary-looking lampposts into concert flutes, turning pieces of loose corrugated iron into cymbals, turning reeds and saplings into harps, and turning a forgotten downspout into a banshee sorely keening her absent fairy kindred. The wind is more like a conductor than it is an instrument. It is God's own conductor, called Ruach by the Hebrews, Prana by the Hindus, Pneuma by the Greeks, and Pepo by the Swahili people. It goes by many aliases: spirit, breath, life force. But by whatever name you call it, it is the music maker supreme. It is God singing as he takes his shower. Words inspired by God. So during the week, I sent out an email which had a synopsis of the last two homilies. I told you I'd given you a heads up that what I want to do now is use this period for question and answers. And so if you had a chance to look at the synopsis, or I included the links to both homilies. And just very basically, 2 weeks ago, I talked about the phenomenon of Jesus being the first great teacher to ever call God Daddy or Father. Nobody else had done it before him. I mean, there's the notion of, a patriarchy of gods on Mount Olympus, or, for the Romans, or the Celts had the Daida, but these were father figures for the gods themselves. But Jesus is the first person to speak to God as Daddy or Abba. And so I unpacked that in 4 different ways for you. I suggested that Jesus calling God Father could be interpreted as the fact that Jesus, in fact, is God enfleshed. That's one interpretation. A second interpretation might be that Jesus is a divine human hybrid, that his father was divine and his mother was human, so that he was some kind of a demiurge or a hybrid in some way. That would be a second unpacking. The third unpacking would be that Jesus is claiming to have a unique, relationship with God, a relationship that nobody else has ever had before or since. Or the fourth interpretation would be to say that Jesus had a unique understanding of God, and he understood that God actually is father and mother to everything that is, that everything that comes into awareness can call God Abba or Abun, our Father. So that's what I did in the homily 2 weeks ago. And then last week I talked about the Tower of Babel and Pentecost. And I spoke about pre-linguistic languages, the ways in which we use sound, our colors, our pheromones to communicate. Animals do, at least. And then I talked about telepathy, the idea of a download of information from one mind to the other without the use of language at all, so that it's somehow translinguistic. And when I looked at the phenomenon of Babel, I suggested, in fact, that these jealous gods who didn't want human beings building a tower to Babel, and so he confused them by scattering them across the world and giving them different languages. And my suggestion was actually that it's not that they spoke a single language and that God confused them and gave us 7,000 different tongues, but rather that we may have been telepathic creatures initially, and God gave us language, and it was language that confuses us. Because I say language is like trying to drink tomato soup with a fork. Language is a very, very leaky thing. And so when I looked at Pentecost then, Pentecost was the absolute undoing of Babel. That the scattering that happened and the diverse languages that happened in Babel is reversed at Pentecost. And everybody present in Jerusalem, and there's diaspora Jews from all over the world, they're all hearing Peter speak in their own languages. So obviously, Peter wasn't multilingual. What was happening is, it was a translingual download that everybody was hearing, was getting a complete download. But as soon as you try to unpack a download, you have to employ language. And of course, as soon as they employ language, they're employing their own languages. And then they're thinking that Peter is speaking those languages, when in fact, it was a download of information from Spirit herself. And so I talked then about Pentecost in slow motion, using a Hindu model of the 7 stages of life. And then finally ask the question of ourselves, are we going to be people of Babel or people of Pentecost? Because the single most important gift that the Spirit gave at Pentecost, when you read John's account of Pentecost, which you find in John chapter 20, where he appears in the room where they're cowering for fear of the authorities, and they have just abandoned him and betrayed him, and he comes in and says, Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you. I'm not coming to upbraid you. I'm not coming to accuse you. I'm telling you, Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you. And the first gift of Pentecost, Jesus says, whose sins you shall forgive, they are forgiven them. And whose sins you shall retain, they are retained. And I pointed out that the Catholic Church totally misunderstood this. This was not permission for only priests to say ego te absolvo. It was the first mandate of Pentecost is that it's your duty to forgive. And when you forgive, everybody is set free. You're set free, others are set free. When you refuse to forgive, when you retain, then you're stuck, you're imprisoned with your anger and your unforgiveness, and everybody else is carrying the burden as well. And so the question I left us with, do we want to be people of Babel who are scattered and confused and speaking different languages and having different perceptions? Or are we people of Pentecost who come back to a telepathic download from Spirit herself? So there's only one translinguistic, medium of communication. And the first injunction of that download is forgiveness of each other. So that's basically a wrap up of the 2 sessions. So we'll open it up now to question answers.
In the past, you've talked about Homo Sociopathicus and Homo Spiritualis.
Right.
And you and I have talked about this idea of the second coming of Christ.
Right.
And working with Steiner's idea of Christ in the etheric. Yes. And my evolving cosmology looks at Christ in the etheric as love. Yes. And it's this broad evolutionary love that's moving us forward. It's not this Christ of just Christianity, but having love that we find with Judaism, what we find with Hinduism, that we find in science, and all of these realms that you talk about. Do you have any thoughts? And so it seems to me that that's what the second coming of Christ is right now, which really has to do with people making this choice towards Homo Spiritualis and really connecting with love and making this choice of love and compassion.
Brilliant idea, Michael. And so for people who may not have heard this concept before, I've had this idea for 30, 40 years at this stage, that Homo Sapiens Sapiens is at a bifurcation point. And we're either going to become Homo Sociopathicus, based on greed and fear and warfare, or Homo Spiritualis, based on compassion and love. Now, Michael is a great student of Rudolph Steiner. And Steiner's idea of the second coming of Jesus, I agree with. The second coming of Jesus for me is not some kind of a cosmic event where Jesus comes down and he's really upset with people because we didn't listen the first time, and he's going to separate us from sheep and goats, and give us a thumbs down or a thumbs up. The second coming of Christ, as far as I'm concerned, happens on an individual basis. It happens heart by heart by heart. It happens for anybody who's operating out of love and forgiveness rather than out of anger and violence. And so last Sunday, I talked about the Hindu model of Pentecost, which is evolution in 7 stages. We go from the physical body, which is vibrating between 400 and 700 nanometers, to the etheric body, the auric body, which is vibrating at a higher level. It's an energy template of which the physical body is simply a hard copy or a printout. Then you have the astral body, which is the place of where we go when we dream at night, where we go beyond space and time. There's no space and time at the dream level. Thoughts create our experience immediately. The fourth level is the mental or mind body, the Platonic realm, where we download great ideas and inspiration and creativity. The fifth level is the psychic body, which is the place in which we're embedded in a field of consciousness, and we're only one. We're entangled together. And therefore, all these apparent psychic abilities, like clairvoyance and clairaudience and clairsentience and psychokinesis, telepathy, they're part of the field, and we're all plugged into it. Number 6 would be the soul body, the soul itself, the bite-sized fractal of God. And then finally, there's source itself. And I distinguish between source and cosmic consciousness, because cosmic consciousness is simply that amount of intelligence which is necessary to create a universe, to sustain the universe, and to evolve the universe. But there's a lot more to God or source than merely the creation and the sustaining of universes. And I use the example of Shakespeare. So you've got the man Shakespeare, and then you've got the extraordinary creativity of this man, and then you've got the result of the creativity, which is collected works. But there's a lot more to Shakespeare than either his collected works or to his creativity. He's a being away beyond that. And in that sense, source is a way beyond even cosmic consciousness. But in that extraordinary model, then, my understanding is that the etheric Christ is now meeting humanity at the next level of us, that we're raising our self-identity from merely our physicality, and we're raising it to the energetic level. And according to Steiner, if I understand him correctly, everything in the universe, including the planets and our own solar system, they also have an etheric level, and Christ and God is using that to help, symbolize and raise the consciousness of us humans. So as we begin to move from mere identification with our physicality and the embrace of our etheric nature, and that's a stage before we get to the astral and the mental and the psychic and the soul level and cosmic consciousness, and finally union with source. And we need to be doing this as individuals and as cultures. But cultures change one person at a time. You can't expect to change or shift a culture if the people of the culture themselves are not committed to their own personal transformation. I've used this example many times before of water projects that I was involved with in Kenya. And in 2 particular projects, most of them were a huge success, but on 2 different projects, one of them, the pipes were faulty and it was not able to deliver the water to the village. In the other one, the pipes were fine, but the source was polluted and we were piping polluted water into the village. So the water represents the people, who are part of the systems, and the pipes represent the systems. So it's not enough to change the system, to put new pipes in. If the new pipes, are peopled by individuals who are themselves not transformed, they'll corrupt the systems and destroy the pipes. And so it needs every single one of us to make a personal commitment that in my thoughts and in my words and in my actions, I eschew any kind of violence completely, any kind of judgment, any kind of unforgiveness. Because if I don't change, the system is not going to change. And if the system doesn't change, we're looking at Homo Sociopathicus. If we make the changes as individual people, we'll transform the systems and transform the cultures and transform the world. And then will be the birth of Homo Spiritualis, or the second coming of Jesus in the etheric realms.
I just have a follow-up. We've talked about evolution, and the evolutionary path chooses A and B. So do you see humanity following both these paths, right? So some of us will choose Homo Spiritualis, some of us will choose Homo Sociopathicus, and that's just the world that we should be willing to work with.
So it's a great question. So here's my understanding of that, Michael. So in some senses, I totally agree that when nature is faced with a choice between A and B, it chooses both A and B. And having chosen A, if it's faced with a choice between C and D, it chooses C and D. or faced with it, once it's chosen B, faced with a choice between E and F, it chooses E and F. So it makes all possible configurations and choices. So in parallel universes, there's provision for every single combination of choices being made. Now the question is, all those actually exist, because when you step outside the physical realm, there is no such thing as the future or time. Everything is in the eternal now. But so we have to try to download that into a time sequence chronology when we're in physical beings. So we know, in fact, that it's observation and attention and focus that actually calls forth the manifestation. And quantum mechanics has been telling us that for 100 years. They call it the observer effect. It is the observation that collapses the wavelength of light down to the particle outcome, the individual photon of light. And the same thing is true about the future. All possible futures exist. They all exist. The question is, which one are we going to call into our reality by attending to it, by focusing on it, and by preparing ourselves to receive that level of message? Now, we're going to do that on an individual basis. I shared with you one time about a vision I had of looking at a huge, huge big rock in a field, and there were 7 billion ropes attached to the rock. And every human being is pulling the rock in a slightly different direction. And there's a form of mathematics called vector analysis. And a vector is simply a commodity that has both magnitude and direction. So for instance, speed is not a vector. Speed is just an amount, like 40 miles an hour. But velocity is a vector. So 40 miles an hour in a northwesterly direction, that's a vector. So I could vectorize all of these ropes. And if I knew exactly what pressure each individual was putting on the rope and what direction they were pulling in, I could tell you precisely how the rock is going to behave and how it's going to move, at what speed and in what direction. Now, I think there aren't actually 7 billion ropes attached to it. We've congealed into maybe 40 or 50 big groups, whether you want to call it communism or capitalism or whatever it is. And so most of us are part of a group of people pulling in a particular direction. So mathematically speaking, whoever applies the most pressure is going to win the day. That is going to be pulled in that particular direction. Now, at some stage then, I think that the bifurcation point consists of the disidentification with the previous articulation of the self, like the physical self. If we find ourselves in a world in which, physically speaking, it's going to hell in a handbasket, and no matter how much effort we put into trying to change it, it's not going to happen, then we simply elevate our consciousness and we identify with a different, higher level of the self. And maybe that, if Homo Sociopathicus is going to win the day, that people who are really committed to a Christ consciousness or Buddha nature simply elevate our identity into the etheric realm, our higher realm. So the physical world continues to be dominated by Homo Sociopathicus. The etheric realms are governed by compassion and by love.
Eric.
My question it's a follow-up to Michael's question, but this idea of, from 2 weeks ago, you mentioned that Christ was the MVP of the avatars, and that he did call God his father for a reason. But I know you just mentioned Buddha nature, and you've talked about the path of the bodhisattva. So my question would they be different levels of awareness, so Buddha and Christ? Because sometimes I'm always thinking about Christ represents the path of love and Buddha represents the path of enlightenment. So they're both pathways, but there's like a different essence, or is it merely just this, the same thing, just disguised as something different?
Two responses to that, Eric. The first one is that I have this crazy notion that the great soul that incarnated as the Buddha subsequently incarnated as the Christ. So in some senses, the soul, the fractal source that incarnated, has been on the planet several times. Once as the Buddha and once as Jesus of Nazareth. So when I talk about Jesus being the MVP, I'm not so much talking about, the carpenter from Nazareth. I'm talking about the soul who incarnated as the carpenter from Nazareth and as the prince, Gautama, Siddhartha. So I had a really profound experience. In 1995, I was invited by the Presbyterian Church in Palo Alto to give a series of 7 lectures for Lent, on Jesus. And the title I gave to the 7 talks was, Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up? And I was doing a lot of meditating as I prepared for these lectures. And on one occasion, I had a real powerful vision of Jesus. And I said to him, did you actually say, I am the way and the truth and the life? Nobody comes to the Father except through me? the response he gave was, yes, I did say that. And it's true. Because the only way is love. And the only truth is love. And the only life is love. And then spontaneously went on, he said, and the Buddha is the way and the truth and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through the Buddha. Because, you know, the way is compassion or enlightenment. You know, and the truth is enlightenment. And the life is enlightenment. So what he's saying is, wherever you find compassion and forgiveness and love, if that's the nature of a being, that's the way to the Father. So it's not that the carpenter from Nazareth had a unique path, and if you don't get baptized, you're going to go to hell. You know, any incarnation of that soul, in some senses, is the MVP. And I would put the Buddha and Jesus here as two versions of that soul.
Karen?
I just wanted to make a sort of a comment. First of all, I mean, there's so much to follow here. It's so brilliant, all of this. It's so, Aaron can follow you, but I have a little bit of trouble. But I will speak from my my Buddhist background and experience on this. You know, attending many retreats for many years and sort of feeling like I call it a half-assed Buddhist. You know, I would kind of like all my secret back habits, you know, bad in my back pocket that, you know, I would pull out. But what happened to me was, you know, I really worked on this path of compassion for so long. And I really look back on it as like a trick, because it was almost impossible for me to override my habitual patterns. And I became like in a heightened awareness of my bad habits. That's okay. My Buddhist path. and then I all of a sudden realized how we are all in this. We are all trapped in this habitual pattern and this, you know, influence of trauma. And it didn't really fix me to be the total compassionate person that I wanted to be, but I just let everybody else off the hook. And that was where the love came from, because I realized how hard it is, and how much confusion there is. And so that's how I sort of bring my two paths together, my Christian and my Buddhist path.
Sorry, go ahead.
You know, the Buddhist path really taught me to sort of have mercy on myself and let everybody else off the hook. And so that's where it meets.
Right. So there's a reason that you said at the beginning that you were a half-assed Buddhist, because you only got half of the compassion piece. Because compassion is about love of self and love of others. And so Jesus would put it very powerfully, you know, you must love your neighbor as you love yourself. The English word as is totally insufficient to grok the meaning of that. It means that you have to love yourself unconditionally. And then if you love your neighbor in the same way that you're loving yourself, you're loving your neighbor unconditionally as well. So compassion has to do with, you know, cutting yourself slack as well. Not just kind of sitting around and waiting for enlightenment to happen. Because Buddhism also teaches that enlightenment is an accident. But if you meditate regularly, you become accident prone. So there are practices we have to engage in. But the act of compassion has to start with compassion for the self. So that doesn't mean excusing myself or letting myself off the hook. It means, you know, radical self-exploration and radical self-acceptance of the me I find in order to move that me towards a higher identity, one in which there is only love. Because ultimately, as we shift our identity, we realize that having compassion for somebody else is actually really selfish, because the other person is me. The other person is just a different perception, a perspective that God is having. God has all possible perspectives. Everything that exists, from, you know, a supernova to a banana slug, is a perspective that God has on our creation. And so compassion is somehow multi-perspectiving, managing to create as many perspectives as possible. And when you have that level of perspective, ipso facto, compassion and love is for the self, because you see God expressing herself in all these forms. So, you know, it's like one hand washing the other. So which is the good hand? Is the good hand the right hand, because I'm using my right hand to wash my left hand? But as I'm washing my left hand, it's washing my right hand, and I realize both hands belong to the same organism. So there is nothing you will ever experience, no event you'll ever come across, and no person you'll ever encounter who is not you. And so I have this weird kind of meditation based on the Hindu model, where I start off, I go from the base chakra. I say, you know, I have a physical body, but I'm not my physical body. I have an etheric body, but I'm not my etheric body. I have an astral body, but I'm not my astral body. I have a mind body, but I'm not my mind body. I have a psychic body, but I'm not my psychic body. I have a soul body, but I'm not even my soul body. I am. I'll leave it at that. And that's obviously not the ego talking. This is not egocentricity. This is relinquishing everything to the God perspective. Because ultimately, there is only the I am. And if you put any qualifier after I am, like I am Irish, or, you know, I am, you know, farmer or whatever, you're diminishing the I amness, which is why God, you know, identifies himself at the burning bush to Moses. And he said, Ehiya Ashir Ehiya. It was interesting because in Hebrew, he didn't actually say, I am who I am. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You can't say I am in Hebrew. You have to get around it by a device called predication without a verb. So what God actually said in Hebrew was, Ehiya Ashir Ehiya, I will be who I will be. In other words, whatever the situation calls for, that is who I am. If the situation calls for a banana slug, that is who I am. If the situation calls for a mountain right outside my window, that is who I am. If the situation calls for Aaron Lovett, that is who I am. If it calls for Hali, that is who I am. There is nothing that God is not. So compassion and love are simply the disidentification with all the lower versions of the self and the identification with the I amness.
Well, now on Karen.
So I had a comment and a couple of questions. The comment was to just thank you for that notion that the great soul may have been the Buddha as well as Jesus. And because it makes it possible for each of us to be the way, the truth, and the life. That a small glimmer perhaps of that, but that we're each, it's possible for each of us to embody that. And I think I'd never quite heard those words in that way. So my questions have to do with telepathy.
Yes.
And it seems to me that, or what I've experienced is that the telepathy, when language is not available, and for example, with pets or with pre-linguistic children, telepathy plays a very big role in communication. And the second part of that has to do with when language is available. It seems to me that telepathic things can come in two ways. They can just come as a knowing. Mm-hmm. They can also come as a second voice.
Yes.
I've had that experience where a person may be talking to me, but I'm also hearing them talk to me in a second, in saying other words at the same time that they're saying the words that they're saying. And so I don't think it's not lost on us, but I think we get a more practice maybe with our pets and our little children.
Brilliant comments, Karen. So you're absolutely right. You know, like any system, there are gradations and levels. And so there are gradations and levels of telepathy. And so, for instance, the voice that I hear in my head is using language. And therefore, to unpack it, I'm going to have to use the linguistic constraints, because every language is a very leaky vehicle to transmit information. So I said last week that language is made up of information bytes. You know, and information is made up of energy quanta, and the quanta of energy are from the divine mind itself. And so when you get down to the level of language, you know, with all the constraints that language implies, a lot of the message is lost. So if there can be a complete download, and I can act on the download without having to unpack it, you know, I'm resonating much more deeply with spirit. And I agree totally with you that that's why I believe that Babel did not consist of the multiplication of languages. It consisted of the introduction of language to beings who were telepathic beforehand. And that Pentecost was exactly the same thing. That all of these people from all over the world, you know, and there's a big list in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, of these Jews from the diaspora, and they mention 20 different nations from which they've come, but they're all hearing Peter speak in their own tongue. And of course, what happened was They're not hearing Peter speaking in a tongue. They're getting a download from Spirit. But as soon as they try to unpack it, they're going to have to unpack it in the language that they're used to. And then they're thinking, oh, Peter must be talking in that language. And so, like any skill set, there are levels of telepathy. And obviously, the ultimate telepathy is to be identified with God. Is to literally be a vessel through which God speaks. And then everything, flows from that. But there's all these gradations all the way down to just the voice in my head that I'm then going to have to kind of grammatically and syntactically, exegete. Yeah, great point.
So could I follow up with just something there? So how do you distinguish whether you're in a sort of telepathy situation? Sometimes it's like you say, it's sometimes like just a download. It's just a knowing that's there. But sometimes I question whether it's something I'm anticipating or projecting onto the person rather than actually hearing it from them.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. And so, we are multifaceted beings. And so we bring every part of us to every kind of experience we're having. So we're going to bring our physicality to the experience. We're going to bring our cultural values to the experience. We're going to bring our own family history to the experience. We're going to bring our own sensorium, depending on, even eyesight, those abilities. So even if we could, and they're talking about it right now, cloning human intelligence.
Yeah.
If you were to create 100 identical clones of Karen Rubin right now, and set them free, within 10 seconds, there'd be 100 different people. Because as soon as you introduce an intelligence to an environment, they're having unique experiences. And it's the interplay between the experiences and the pre-existing personality that, evolves the personality. So literally, there wouldn't be clones. After 10 seconds, there wouldn't be clones. They'd be radically different from each other. Now, we bring that level of self, all these levels of self, to every exchange we have. And so, even if I have a telepathic experience, it's hard to know sometimes, did I actually, was this precognitive that I knew this person was going to talk to me? Or was I in telepathic exchange and I implanted some kind of an idea in them and then they came back to me and articulated it? So there are so many different facets. And again, the thing is, if we're embedded in the field, there is no beginning, there was nobody who said it and nobody who heard it. You're embedded in the field. The field contains all the information, and it's only a question of waking up to the realization I'm in the field. And therefore, all information is embedded in me as long as I realize that me is not Sean, that me is the I am. And then there are no barriers whatsoever. And there's no time. So I didn't have the time to implant the idea in you, so you could give me a telepathic sentence that I could then attribute to you. Although it came from me to begin with. It didn't come from me or you, it came from I am. And we're embedded in the field of I amness.
Johanna?
I think I sent an email to you about this, and it's about the Aramaic language.
Yes.
Is the really, the interpretations of it are different than English, say. Phrases or words in Aramaic have a big span of capability. And I think that a huge part of our history in the world, a lot in the West, had to do with the interpretation of our Father. Instead of the original Aramaic has some other phrases that are closer, like birthing principle of the universe is one. So it actually delineated a sex to God. That particular phrase. And then I even remember hearing somebody gave a talk at COJ. She was a very brilliant woman. She went to Stanford and I can't think of her name, but she talked about how the phrase, the Virgin Mary in the original Aramaic was a young woman.
Yes.
So that actually got changed. So there's two huge things that, a lot of Western civilization is based on that this is Big Daddy God in the sky, which is, I think, a more huge and profound influence. And I think the Mary part, I think that maybe came from, Mary the Virgin came from other birthing myths that a virgin woman bore a child or something like that. So just wanted to.
So that's the issue once you have language and once you have culture. because language then is going to be reinterpreted. So the passage about Mary the Virgin, that was a misinterpretation of Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, which was a promise that was being made by Isaiah to the young king of Israel at the time. Israel was under siege. It was the time when the Assyrian Empire in the north had demolished the northern kingdom of Israel. And the kingdom of Judah wanted to go into an alliance with the Assyrians against their own brothers and sisters in the north. And Isaiah is trying to persuade the prince not to do it, that God will be their protector. And he said, in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, he says, the young maiden will be with child. The king had just married, and his wife was, hopefully was going to get pregnant with the new king. So he said, hang in there. Your wife, whom you've just taken, is pregnant, and she's going to give birth to a child. So the young maiden, the word that's used in the original, and the Old Testament is written not in Aramaic, it's written in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the word is the young maiden, and there was a newly married woman. So it was a promise to the king. I think he may have been Hezekiah. I'm forgetting the king's name. It was a promise to the young king that if he relied on God rather than on military might, his kingdom would survive. Matthew then gets a hold of that statement, and he translates it in a very, very different way. There are two very different words in Greek. Matthew is writing in Greek. There are two words in Greek, one for virgo intacta, a girl whose hymen is intact, and the other for a young maiden. And so Matthew is using a particular notion that speaks about a virgo intacta. So of course they're playing around with words. The same thing with the Aramaic. Our father, Abun, in Aramaic can mean birthing principle of the cosmos. But any language is going to be leaky. And so you have to, as you treat any kind of biblical passage particularly, you have to try to play around with different languages. One of my favorite examples is, so Wavin just read the Our Father for us today as the first reading. I was lucky enough to learn the Our Father in Gaelic as a child, and then in English in school, then in Swahili, then in Kipsigis, and then in 2 other Kenyan languages. And what I found out is that every interpretation or retranslation of the Our Father has weak points and strong points. And so, for instance, in English, the phrase, lead us not into temptation, that never made sense to me. And it's the same in the Latin, said, libera nos a mala, but deliver us from evil. So this notion that, we're asking, please don't lead us into temptation, that never made sense to me. The Irish version of that is very different. In Gaelic, we say, ná lig sin I gahu. Now, kahu in Gaelic means straits or difficulties or problems. So when you say, ná lig sin I gahu, there's 2 possible meanings in Gaelic. It could mean either, don't allow us to stay in difficulties. If we get ourselves in straits, don't allow us to stay there. Ná lig sin, don't allow us to remain there. Or it can mean also, ná lig sin I gahu, don't allow us to wander in to a situation like that. So the Gaelic of that one phrase has a totally different meaning than the English or the Latin of that. Now, the same as Swahili has, an understanding of forgiveness that neither the Gaelic nor the Latin or the English have. So you have to be really, really careful as you cherry pick languages. Languages coming through cultures. And by cross-fertilizing a whole bunch of cultures, you may be able to get down to the bedrock. I've used this example before. I live completely off the grid in the middle of the mountains. I have my own water supply. I have a well that was drilled down 260 feet. The water is pristine water that comes from the Sierras, 150 miles away. It's coming underground and it's filling the water table. But it's coming up through geological strata, which are contaminated with lead and aluminum and stuff like that. So I had to do a 3-part cleansing before I can drink the water. I had to turn the hard water into soft water. I had to take minerals out of it. I have to take bacteria out of it, because during the movement of the water from the table up through the geological strata is taking on a lot of contaminants. And that's true of language. When spirit downloads, it's spring water from the Sierras, but it percolates through religions and through languages and through cultures, and it takes on all kinds of toxins. Now, if I wanted to figure out what the real water in my land is like, if I were to invite 40 other people in Northern California to sample their wells and then see what do they have in common, we'd find the real water. Or if I went down really, 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 really deeply below the geological strata, I'd find the real water. But unfortunately, It's very, very difficult for us. We all grew up in religions, in cultures, with particular languages, and they've articulated the human experience in very, very particular ways. And now in order to try and grok the internal meaning, the easiest way would be to go back to the I am and have it download so that I'm not trying to eat my tomato soup with a fork. So it's not that Aramaic was a special language. It was another language. It had its strengths and its weaknesses. English has its strengths and its weaknesses. Gaelic has its strengths and its weaknesses. We have to kind of go beyond language to get the purity of the download of I amness.
Sharon and Bill.
This is associated with the questioning that Michael and Eric came up with at the beginning. And in the meantime, this question has evolved quite a bit. But you mentioned previously that as individuals choosing their future, do individuals that are choosing a different future, do they physically just sort of fade away from us, or when they are no longer on our individual chosen path? Or is this something that, like a soul, when we choose to reincarnate, that those individuals are no longer associated with the path that we choose for the future? And also, as a second question, I always thought that the human race or the souls would no longer advance individually, but unless everyone in our soul group was able to advance with us.
Two great questions. Yeah, sure. And so to your first question, you had two possibilities for the first question, and I would say both of them are true. It's not just that we have to kind of eke out the rest of this incarnation and then hopefully in the next incarnation make a move. You can move in this incarnation. You can literally bring your sense of identity into a space of compassion and love. And right in the middle of all this chaos in which we find ourselves in 2020 on planet Earth, you can be in a space of tranquility and love and compassion even then. So you can still manage that level of serenity and tranquility even in a physical space suit. You don't have to wait, get rid of this spacesuit, and the next time back, I'll find yourself in a better situation. So that's the first way. So it's both and. Obviously, from incarnation to incarnation, then, as the individual person is making progress into compassion, they're level for the next level of the game or the task. As regards your second question, I believe there's a big difference between enlightenment and salvation. And so I've said to you many, many times that nobody is saved until everybody is saved, only in the sense that if you're a really enlightened being, a compassionate bodhisattva, you're going to keep incarnating until everybody wakes up. I told you the story about a Special Olympics that was held in Montreal sometime in the 1970s. And one of the races was a group of Down syndrome's young adults for a 100-yard dash. And they started the starting line, and the starter has the gun, fires the gun, and they all kind of trundle up the path. And halfway up, one of the kids falls and cuts his knee and starts crying. And all of the runners stop and they turn around and they walk back down the track and they pick up their fallen comrade and they link arms and they all walk across the finishing line together. And the whole stadium gave them a standing ovation. Now, that's what it's like, I think, to be truly enlightened. Yeah, how can you rest in heaven? How can you be saved, and say, whew, I made it, if there are other beings who are still asleep? And so you'll continue to minister, and there are many ways of ministering. I mean, there are angel guardians right now looking out for every single one of us. I told you this vision I had where at every intersection point between a line of latitude and a line of longitude, there's a being of light stationed on planet Earth, and one at the North Pole and the South Pole. That's 64,442 light beings, and that's just a symbolic number. We're surrounded by light beings who are, loving us, being compassionate and intervening in some senses. So you don't have to be in physical flesh in order to continue a ministry of compassion. And so some people will choose to take on physicality and do it like in the trenches. And some people will choose to do it at a different level. But it's all God, moving all of us into compassion and into love. We're just different players on the same team. Somebody is a quarterback. Somebody else is a running back. Somebody else is a nose guard. We're all in different places, but we're all part of the same team.
Both the Babel story and the Pentecost story and some of the things you said are very much about language.
Right.
But obviously, you know, love is about everything and how we act in the world. In your liturgy, after we say, after the Our Father, may we always experience the peace of God, there's always that beautiful line I enjoy, and may we live in such a way that others can experience it too. Can you comment on the living as opposed to the language part of being at the level of love?
That's brilliant, brilliant, Lawrence. So it's the difference between understanding a teaching and practicing a teaching. Yeah, you can study Buddhism for 100 years, you know, and be able to quote the Buddha on every topic under the sun. You can study the scriptures and be able to quote Jesus in every instance, you know, but there's a big difference between the acquisition of that information and the teaching and the practice of it. And so how does one then translate, you know, the lessons and the learnings and the downloads into action? The first one for me, the first indication that you're on the path to enlightenment is a sense of humor. And I'm not joking you. There's a great story in, I think it's Philip's Gnostic Gospel, where Jesus is baptized by John in the Jordan, and he comes out of the river and he breaks into this huge big belly laugh. Now, it's not that Jesus was just mocking anybody. It was that even Jesus, it's like he'd broken through the last barriers of the illusion of his space suit. And so the first sign of enlightenment is the ability to laugh at the fact that I've lived my life under an illusion heretofore. And it's the laughter that a parent has when they're watching a little baby trying to stand up and walk, and the baby falls on our butt. And the parents think this is hilarious. And the baby picks itself up again and tries again and falls on its butt and picks it up and then eventually starts walking. It's the joy of the parent watching the child evolve that leads to the laughter. It's not a sarcastic, you know, cynical, critical laughter. And so the first laughter is laughing at myself, that I've had the ability to see how much of an illusion my life has been and my belief system has been. And so that beautiful passage that, again, it was Wavin is reading today, after Jesus had taught us the Our Father, he said, ask and you shall receive. There is a version of that in Thomas's Gnostic Gospel, which is even more powerful. It doesn't say just ask, you know, and seek and knock. It says, anybody who asks will receive. And when you receive, you will be dismayed or disturbed. And when you're disturbed, you will marvel. And when you marvel, you will rule. And when you rule, you will rest. So seek, find, be disturbed, marvel, rule, and rest. That's the journey. And the first piece is you have to set out to find the truth. So starting with your own family of origin and your own religion of origin, you have to go beyond that. Jesus had to do it at age 12. So at 8 days, Jesus is baptized into the wisdom tradition of his parents, Judaism, which is a beautiful system. At age 12, he reckons, you know, I got to break beyond this. It can't just be about, you know, Torah. There must be some other truths out there. And so he begins debating with the wise men in the temple, with the rabbis in the temple. So Jesus now is going beyond the wisdom tradition in which he was born. And it was very important. You have to be born into a system and nurtured by a system. Then you have to seek beyond that, not abandoning what you've had, but seeking that which is not covered by what you have. So when you seek, you will find it. But when you find it, I guarantee you, you'll be disturbed. If you've been a typical Catholic, you know, born as I am, 1946, right up to 2020, if your eyes are open, you'll have been disabused that the Catholic Church is the one true church founded by Jesus and that the Pope is an infallible human being. If you read church history, you're going to find out a very, very different story. And so you're going to have an understanding of Jesus, which is very different from the version that you learned as a child. And that's really disturbing. So disturbing that many people will stop searching at that stage and retreat. And Christ will save those people. Anybody who puts his hand to the plow and looks backwards is not worthy of me. Christ is asking us to forge ahead, plow ahead. But when you have the courage to be disturbed, then you begin to marvel because you're beginning to see there's a much more beautiful story here, a much bigger story than the one I had. So you're going to marvel at the scope of what's opening up to you. And then you'll rule, not in the sense that you have control over anybody, but that for the first time ever, you have control over your own journey. You're choosing where to look for love and compassion. And then finally you rest because at some stage, you've done what you need to do, and now you can just not to sit and rest on your laurels, but that you have what it takes now to be a feeder of other people, to be a fisher of human beings. So what are some of those practices? So you laugh first at your own illusion. Then you laugh at the illusions of the world, not cynically, but in sympathy, for the ways in which we're stuck. And then you go to stuff like meditation, spending time with little children, watching their eyes, spending time in nature, watching what nature does, doing an examination of consciousness at the end of the day, figuring out with what level of consciousness have I lived my day. It's not about examination of conscience, like how many times did I break the third or the fifth or the sixth commandment today? It's about with what level of consciousness or awareness have I lived my day today. It's about feedback, self-generated feedback. It's about feedback from friends. It's about feedback from, a spiritual director, so that we're trying to grow each other, that we become anamachardza. In Gaelic, there's this beautiful phrase, anamachara means a soul friend, not necessarily a lover, but two twin souls who've contracted to walk in incarnation together and be teachers for each other. Then we're all anamachardza for each other. So then there are a plethora of practices that have been given to us by all the great wisdom traditions. When you get beyond the level of the scriptures and beyond the level of ritual and beyond the level of dogma, you get right down to the download of spirit itself, then the practices will become obvious to you. And then you become a changed person. And by changing who you are, you change your culture. And by changing your culture, you change your world.
Waving Dean.
Hey, Father Sean, this will be an easy soft pitch, okay? So you figure that all of us here that have found our way to be together with you and to, through our collective ways we found each other, all part of a bigger soul group or affinity collective.
Right.
See, that was easy, quick.
Yes, it was quick. And so I'm not saying that COJ is special. What I'm saying is that I think that every human being on planet Earth right now is here because we've chosen to be here now. So there are levels of commitment and levels of kind of community. So initially, each soul, I think, has some kind of a soul friend, an anamachara. And it could be a lover, it could be a brother or sister, it could be a parent, it could be a best friend of the same sex. It can be anybody, but somebody with whom you have an extraordinarily close connection. That's the first level. It ripples out then to the family of which you're a part, both the people you find easy to be around and the ones you find difficult to be around. Then you move out from that, the next level is the community, then the tribe, then the nation, then the human family, then all life on planet Earth, then all sentient beings throughout the cosmos. We're all interconnected, we're all embedded in the field of I amness. But at various stages, because we're operating with this tiny little 3-pound massive wetware that we carry between our ears, we're only able to grok little pieces of the puzzle. We can't see the whole jigsaw puzzle. We can only see tiny little parts of it. So maybe we're able to see our family or our community or our church group or whatever. But we're embedded in much, much bigger groups than that. But since this is where we're spending a lot of our time and energy, then we have to make sure that we're in a community that does two things for us. It has to support us in our search, and it has to challenge us in our beliefs. If we're part of a community that only challenges us, we lose heart and give up. If we're part of a community that only kind of applauds us, then we're going to stagnate. So like any good relationship, I say this constantly when I'm marrying couples, there has to be enough difference in the relationship to make it exciting. And there has to be enough commonality to make it, easy. So that's what any great relationship is, consists of these two elements. And the same thing is true as a community. We have to be a community that challenge each other and support each other in our search. We don't have to, we're not, cookie cutter, clones of some kind of idea. We're individual people who found each other in order to help each other to grow and support each other in that journey.
Final question from Ingrid.
I know that the most profound words that you can use to connect with God is I am, that I am, that I am. I came across Paul Selig. I don't know, are you familiar with his channeled text? Well, he's pretty amazing. And he has his own version of those, that invocation. And he's expanded it through his channeled teachings. He says, I know who I am in truth and freedom. I know what I am in truth and freedom. And I know how I serve in truth and freedom.
Beautiful. That's beautiful, I mean, yeah. So the trick for us is to kind of, to get into that space gradually, to kind of move ourselves up through the kind of the levels of body from identification with physicality, emotionality, intellectuality, or even personality, to identification ultimately with the fact that we are actors in God's dream. I keep repeating this phrase again and again and again. that life is a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that source is having. So we have to wake up to the fact that we're in a dream. And that there are, here we go, Wavin again, Russian dolls, nested, dreams within dreams within dreams within dreams. The ultimate source is just, I am, God, ourself. Everything else then is a lesser version of that. And so we have to work our way into that identification and not get sidelined by misidentifying with a body that's hurting or an emotion that's feeling angry. Yeah. Guys, thank you so much for your patience. We've been at this now for 50 minutes, so cut you a break and let's get on with the Eucharist.